Okay, so it's a great pleasure for me to be here, and I kind of like the first slide because it says indeed Chairman SciPost Foundation, so it sounds very, very nice. But actually, my day job, my already over full-time job, is more mundane in a sense. I'm actually a professor of theoretical physics at the University of Amsterdam, and this is really how I want you to think about me, because for me, essentially, most of my waking hours are spent thinking about out-of-equilibrium many-body quantum systems. That's really what fuels me, what motivates me to, really get up in the morning and do my stuff. This is a group that, a kind of time-integrated version of my group from a while ago, so I'm very thankful to many funding organizations that make this possible. And then, there's a little bit of a parallel because I said it was out-of-equilibrium systems, so maybe I thought, yeah, publishing is a nice industry to get into because it's quite out of equilibrium. So, just got into it a couple of years ago after much talking with colleagues. We kind of felt that there was still space for scientists, active scientists, to contribute maybe to the reform of the publishing world that we have. A good point to start, of course, I'm going to talk mostly about peer refereeing, but I do want to start talking a little bit about motivations for scientists to get involved in that. There are many points of concern that we scientists have about publishing. Some of them are quite simple. Some of them are actually not very often discussed in conferences like this, and I would like you to make sure you don't forget these things. There are a number of annoyances on the side of scientists on the work floor with the way publishing happens, paywalls and things like that. This is really something that people are quite bitter about. The usefulness or the kind of constructive nature of refereeing is also really an issue. There's perhaps a perception that there's a bit of lack of editorial expertise in the actual subject matter of the publications, that this does affect decisions at some point. One particular point of concern is the use of non-scientific criteria in publication decisions. This is really something that we're not happy with. And of course, if you look at the careers of young scientists and the impact that their publication CV has on their career, the observation is that very often the name of the journal in which the work is published is more important than the actual content. So there's a lot of thought about these things. So essentially, I was talking about that for a long time, and then my colleagues were just saying, well, JS, if you care so much about these things, why don't you just shut up and do something about it? So then I indeed tried to do something about it, and the idea is that we started a publication platform which, if you want, forms a complete publishing system above the preprint handling infrastructure of the archive that we're, at least in physics, completely used to. So it's a fully featured publishing entity. It does essentially everything that, that publishers want to do on it. The running of this whole thing, the whole kind of framework behind it, is run by professional scientists, so people who are already employed in universities. And what it does offer, of course, we've got some journals. We offer also a platform for commentaries on existing literature. We want to have an infrastructure also for theses. And the two-word summary is that we use the keyword openness to drive towards quality. And I'll try to explain a little bit how that works. What do we aim to achieve, actually? So admittedly, we're quite ambitious in what we do. We're just going to try to go as far as we can with that. We want to implement what I like to call true-to-spirit open access. So open accessibility has been historically mostly about readers. I think we forget really the plight of the authors in there. There's a question of accessibility of the platforms in there. So we like to call it two-way open access here. We want to be very strict in decoupling the financial from the scientific. The financial issues maybe are not the strengths of scientists, so we want to isolate them from that. We want to implement a new funding structure here, maybe not new, but kind of slightly different funding structure to the current ones. But most importantly, that's what I'll focus on later on. We want to modernize the refereeing procedure. We feel a little bit that the current system is too antiquated and that scientists are much more open to novelty in there than you might think. One of the keys here is that we do want to give more credit to referees. Refereeing takes a lot of time, it takes a lot of effort, and it's not properly recognized at this stage. And although I kind of value the idea of maybe giving a little bit of money to the referees to do their thing, even the amounts that are mentioned in there are a complete underestimate of the true involvement needed in order to do proper review. So I think it's better not to go down that road at all. If you want me to do a big review and you want to pay me for it, then I will send you an invoice for a much higher figure than the one that you offer me. So I'd rather not be offered a small amount and do it pro bono. But at least if you allow me to get credit for this, or at least see my review, perhaps as a kind of subsidiary form of publication on top of the journal article, I think this is much more productive. I'm already paid by my university. I don't need extra bribes to do my work. We want to streamline also the post-publication feedback. The idea that a publication is final and kind of all agreed upon and all certified at the moment of publication is incorrect. It's not the way scientific progress occurs. You have to view it much more as a kind of continuously evolving process. And in that sense, kind of openness in refereeing is just translating to the publication world what happens on a daily basis in scientific conferences. In fact, I find the audience here extremely friendly. The discussion is very friendly. I would like you to come to a scientific conference at some point where people who you know very well get up and ask, relatively, well, not necessarily friendly questions, very tough questions. Scientific debate, discussion is something that is done in a mature way by the community, and I think this can be transposed also to the publishing world. We, later on, also want to really reform the impact assessment, but maybe that's a subject of discussion for another talk. Okay, so just very quickly, the organizational structure, there's one thing that you should know. There's an editorial college. So all the editorial decisions are taken as a communal decision by the editorial college. So at the moment, this is composed of a bit more than 50 quite high caliber physicists. We're busy in physics, and this model is essentially something which is very slightly different from things that you've seen. So atmospheric chemistry and physics also has like hundreds of editors on its boards. The decision process is very slightly different, but it's a bit in the same spirit. Okay, so in fact, so atmospheric chemistry and physics was really one of the big inspirations for us in all of that, and what Copernicus does in there. Okay, so the idea of the flow of manuscripts here is relatively straightforward. So once the manuscript is submitted, it is exposed to the pool of fellows, one of which has to develop interest in it in order to take charge of it and then invite referees for processing. If no fellow is interested in the paper is, if you want, desk rejected, just resent to the authors. So this should happen within about a week of work. Now, once the manuscript is taken charge of by one of the fellows, a submission page is opened, and the editor in charge invites a number of specific academics to provide referee reports. On top of that, so this is just like the traditional way. On top of that, we have what we label contributors to SciPost. So these are by definition active professional scientists, so people who are at least of PhD level and above. We verify who is who. Those people are actually also able to comment on the paper or provide a report on the paper before the publication decision is taken. The reports are put online after quick vetting by the editor in charge. So provided that there's no abusive language in there or that there's no big problems in the report will come online for everybody to see before the editorial decision is taken. Importantly, the reports that we ask of the referees, they can be anonymous. We debated quite a lot about forcing signing of reports. We decided against it simply because we thought that the community was not quite ready for this. However, this is really the direction we would want to go into. In the future, we would like the reports to actually be signed by people, but for the moment, we don't do that. The important thing is that having the report online achieves most of the advantages of openness here that we wanted to get to. After the reports are obtained, the fellow in charge makes a recommendation to the college for acceptance, or well, first of all, maybe the editor wants to ask for revisions of the papers or modifications, in which case it's returned to the authors provide a resubmission, we go through the cycle again. Once the moment comes for a decision, the editor in charge makes a recommendation to the college. The publication decision is taken, as I said before, by the college as a whole. So no single editor has ultimate decisional power on these things. Okay, so that's how the decision process works. And we ensure that there's enough membership of the college to cover the specializations that we have to cover. Okay? So some very quick statistics about submissions, and of course here you have to, like I say, heed the central limit theorem, fluctuations like square root of n. So these are very indicative, just to give you a little bit of an impression. The first thing you should notice is that we essentially have an extremely high acceptance rate. So you might think high acceptance rate, low quality, but then you can read the article by Uli Peuschel from a few years ago that demonstrated that an open refereeing process has this multiple miracle associated to it, where acceptance rates shoot through the roof and quality shoots through the roof. Okay? Simply because the openness of the process is a disincentive for low quality submitters to participate in this. Okay? And this really, really, really works. Essentially, so the number of submissions is slowly increasing, but we think it's going to stay about like this. I think we'll converge maybe to a kind of refusal rate which is higher than this, like 10% or something, but it's not going to be that far from that. Okay? Statistics about refereeing, again, low numbers. Here, essentially, the important thing to see is that actually, despite the fact that we put the reports online, about 50% of the people we invite to provide a report actually do provide a report. And this statistic is like quite optimistic, quite favorable as compared to what you would have thought. In fact, some of the reports that we did not get at some point, I figured out that it was because the invitation sometimes landed in spam filters of people. But anyway, so we'll see. I think it's going to stay about like this. The other important statistic here is that although we give the opportunity to referees to sign their reports, very, very few of them do it at the moment. Okay? We only have of the order, call it 1% of people who do that. I think here there's a culture change which is needed, which is not from your side, it's from our side. Okay, so at a conference, once again, if you ask a question to somebody, well, your identity is revealed. Okay? Actually, what we want to get to is to bring the report itself to a type of publication to put on someone's CV. And the argument is very often that, okay, if I'm a young researcher and I want to shoot down this Nobel Prize winner because he just wrote this article which is complete bollocks, I'd rather do it anonymously. To which the counter-argument is, well, if you're talking about missed occasions, yeah, you kind of, because if you are correct and you actually point a correction to this famous researcher's work and you put your name on it, then, at least you can collect the credit for it. Okay, so it goes both ways. It cuts both ways. But I do think that essentially it's just a question of time to transform the culture. I had much need for explanation to my colleagues at first to justify the fact of putting the reports online before publication. Even that was a big wall to cross. But interestingly, a number of the people who were very doubtful about this at first have come back to me later and said, look, this is clearly much better than what we had before. So many colleagues were convinced by that. Sometimes the reports are quite hard, but what we tend to strive for is to encourage people to provide constructive reports. And in fact, in that sense, I think physics is very much behind other fields of science. So other platforms have really shown that open refereeing can be quite critical and useful, but that people can live with this. You're talking to scientists here, quite mature people, you would hope. So I think openness can really work in here. Okay, so I think, I'm not quite sure how much time I still have. But 2 minutes, yeah. So essentially, if you want to have a look at some of the reports, it's quite simple. Just go to the site and you will see essentially links back from the published things to the actual submission pages of the papers on which you can still find reports, author replies on this, see how this affected one version into the other until the final publication is obtained. Okay, but I think that's a summary of what I wanted to say, and I can thank you for your attention.
Hello, everyone. So Jean-Sébastien talked about his field and what gets him out of bed in the morning. And what gets me out of bed in the morning, apart from my children, is open science and open scholarship, which I really believe as an agenda is fundamental to the future of science. And I truly believe that access to knowledge and participation in systems of knowledge creation are fundamental human rights. And if you limit people's access to take part in that dialogue, then you limit them fundamentally as a person. So it's been my pleasure to work for the last 3 years for Open Air in this capacity. And I should mention that this is actually my final week for Open Air. I'll be moving to a research institute in Austria as of the start of October. So Open Air exists to foster social and technical links to enable open science in Europe and beyond. Many of you are probably perhaps aware of it. It implements and monitors primarily the open science policies of the European Commission. It's a human network of 33 national open access desks, as well as a digital network that tries to link publications to data and so on. It started as an open access project, and in the same way that the open access agenda is flowered into the open science agenda, Open Air moved from open access to open science. So what is open science? I crowdsourced on Twitter a few of what are the principles of open scholarship, and I just want to pick out a few here. So it's about bringing transparency, accountability, and inclusivity to scholarship, more responsibility, more community, and more collaboration in research, more visibility, particularly for perhaps researchers from parts of the world that have been underrepresented previously, as well as about technical principles like reproducibility, findability, accessibility, interoperability, reusability. But all these principles are all very good, and they're kind of a bit free cake. I don't think that any of us would disagree on the whole that most of them are a good thing, but it's about how they are implemented, how they are operationalized. So open science, as well as being a bunch of principles, is also a bunch of practices. It's about open access to publications, which is most germane to this conference, but also to data, to software, to educational resources. It's about opening up methodologies, and we heard in Jean-Claude Bergelmann's talk about the movement to stop publication being an added extra at the end of research, that publication should be a process that accompanies research the whole way through. So open notebook science, study pre-registration. It's also about citizen science, so bringing a greater participation. And then it's about systems of open evaluation, and here is where we come to open peer review. So in the current project, Open Air 2020, we had one task, which was to look at open peer review, and this was my task. So, not to go too long on this, but traditional peer review, we know, it's based on human judgments, and as such, it obviously is never going to be perfect. And the system as it's currently implemented has some problems of time. A lot of people complain that it holds up research. It has problems or perceived problems of accountability and bias, not knowing who your reviewers are, if they give you a bad review, do they have conflicts of interest and so on. It has a lack of incentives, we know. The main incentive is to give back to your community. But when you've got a lot of other incentives that have deadlines on them, then maybe that giving back gets pushed to the side. And also, there is wasted effort involved there. These are the opinions of experts. Average reviews take 4 to 6 hours to write, and they're put in the archives, or more likely into the bin, once the publication is put online, usually. And we know that a publication is not a finished product, and it's not a perfect product. And those reviews contain lots of great contextual information, which could help researchers to understand the arguments for and against certain findings. So peer review has some problems. and open science is an emergent agenda. So this is where we start. So my first task, I'm a studied librarianship and philosophy, so I'm not from publishing. And my first task was to understand what do people mean when they talk about open peer review. And I found it difficult at first. I still find it difficult. So it's best probably if we define it in distinction to traditional peer review, which is normally anonymous, at least for the reviewers, so usually single-blind, although double-blind is more prevalent in humanities and social sciences. It's usually opaque or confidential, to use a less loaded term, which is that neither the process or the reviews are made public. And it's usually selective in that the reviewers are selected by editors. So open peer review, to find out what it was, I conducted a systematic review. I went to Web of Science and other databases. I looked up the terms open peer review, and I categorized and coded what was given as the definition in each of those cases. So the corpus that I collected had 122 definitions in total. And within those, I identified 7 distinct traits. The main ones are open identities, which is reviewers are named to authors. Open reports, which means that the reports are made public. Another key factor was open participation, and this seems to be more central to the definition of open peer review within the humanities and social sciences. Definitions from those fields seem to more often give open participation as a reason. And open participation is that the reviews are crowdsourced, so it's not that editors are finding particular reviewers and asking them to review. There were other traits such as opening manuscripts before review, so putting them online immediately, and allowing commenting on the final versions of record, and as well as decoupling peer review. And I should say something about the pluses and minuses. So these are all very distinct innovations to the traditional peer review process, and they all have very distinct pluses, benefits, and drawbacks, which means that we need to be clear what we're talking about when we're talking about open peer review, because if we're talking about different systems, and I found 22 distinct configurations of these traits within the definitions, if we're talking about different systems, then we will be talking about different benefits and drawbacks. And when we're looking to judge the efficacy of open peer review, then it becomes especially important to be clear about exactly which configurations we are talking about. So the pluses and minuses of open identities and open reports in particular. So open identities is presumed that if people are putting their name, that they will invest more effort and care, perhaps, that there'll be more transparency so that conflicts of interest might be more readily identifiable. And with open reports, the main advantages here, the contextual information, there's the reuse issue, there's the transparency to be able to see how the sausage is made, so to speak, of publications. And there's the question of credit. So there's an incentive problem. Why do people review? They do, usually to give back, but can we enable systems of credit, which means that they're able to get promotion and tenure based on these activities? That depends on those reports being open and accessible, and the reviewers having their names attached to them. So this is how those traits were distributed. So open identities was really the key trait, and open reports. And these are those configurations. I'll skip this. So this was the first step, defining open peer review. And next we moved on to measure attitudes to open peer review. Do researchers want these systems? If so, which configurations, in which contexts, and so on. So to start, we held a workshop in June 2016 with the LPUB conference in Göttingen, which is where I have been based. And they showed that there are very heterogeneous views on what open peer review is, and that the main the main note from the day, or the keynote, was that no one size fits all, and different disciplinary communities and cultural differences must be taken into account in the design of these systems. This is especially important when you consider how many different types of system there can be. And then we went on with an open air to publish an online survey in September and October of 2016. It was an open online survey. It attracted more than 3,000 responses from authors, reviewers, and editors. The preprint is online at this link. Is currently under review and should appear shortly. The survey itself, because it was open online, it had an uneven coverage of disciplines. Copernicus were nice enough to send direct links to their mailing list, so we had a huge spike with earth and environmental sciences, a pretty good distribution, but perhaps underrepresentation with humanities and social sciences. And so what did that research show? We asked, should research, how much time do I have? I've lost track.
Yeah, it's not too much left.
Oh, okay. So I'll move on then. Sorry. This is what I was going to say anyway. Okay, so open peer review is already mainstream. Within our sample, more than three quarters had practical experience either as reviewer, author, or editor. When you take into account the range of practices that might come under or might be considered as open peer review practices, that might explain this. And more than 60% believe that open peer review should be common practice. So not that it should be the default system, but there should be common practice within scholarly publishing. So this showed that there is definite interest for open peer review, but the responses on each of the particular traits were positive across the board, except for open identities. And this ties in with previous survey findings. This is something that really must be addressed, because a lot of the conversation about adding credit for peer review through open peer review is based on persuading researchers to put their names to articles. So next steps. We need more transparency. So to be clear on peer review policies and what the implications are for reviewers and authors when they sign up because I mean it's very confusing for reviewers when there are different systems of peer review at different journals. We need more education about what open peer review is and how to review responsibly under those conditions. We need more incentives, and the announcement last week from Crossref that they'll be creating a specific metadata schema for the registration of DOIs for open peer reviews. It's great news on this. But most of all, and this is where I want to finish, we need more evidence. So this is a quote from a blog from an early career researcher called Libby Peer, which I did advise everybody to read if they can, which really, I think, captures the ambivalence or the mix of feelings that a lot of researchers have with open peer review. Why should she, as an early career researcher, risk perhaps other more senior colleagues taking offense to something that she said? And she says that there just isn't the evidence yet to say whether or not this works. And so the note that I want to finish on, open peer review is a very complex issue. What should be made open, in which circumstances, at which stage, and to whom? These are all questions that must be answered when you're deciding to implement any of these 22 different configurations. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. This is a good thing. But we need more evidence to help us judge what works in what circumstances. So the definition The research on definitions I've published on F1000. It's currently in second version and not been peer-reviewed again yet. But I look through the evidence for the efficacy of each of those traits, and it's really vanishingly thin in many cases. And when you think that peer review is the central quality assurance process for science, then this is just astounds me, really astounds me. So we need more evidence. So what I think we need, there are data sharing initiatives. The PEERI network is doing great work to bring together the different peer review sets, the data, and make it available to their researchers. But this is data sharing. It's not open data. Open peer review, because it's open science, means that we can make a lot of that information already is there on the web. But if we can collect it and bring it together in one central place, then maybe we can motivate a more concerted effort to judge the efficacy of open peer review. So what I would like to explore next, in particular with open peer review publishers, is coming together to find a multi-stakeholder agreement on priorities for research, and then to open up the data in a consistent way, and then to do cross-publisher and journal studies on what works and what doesn't. And in this way, then, we might be able to overcome some of these fears about open peer review. I'm sorry, Xenia, if I was too... Thank you.
I'm at F1000. I've been there for nearly coming up for 2 years now, but I've spent predominantly most of my career thus far working at a funding agency. So I worked at the Wellcome Trust doing evaluation of research for a long time before moving to F1000. So I do have a bit of multiple hats here. And many of the themes, one of the kind of things about going last and also going just before lunch is either things have been said, but also you're all kind of itching a little bit, but I was told that it's better to go before lunch than after lunch, so whoever's going after lunch, good luck. So what I'm really going to talk about here, some of the things that I've said have been covered. There have been various references to some of the things that we're doing at F1000. For those of you who don't know, the company was started by Vitek Trash, who is known pretty much well known throughout the whole publishing industry as someone who was one of the fathers of open access, but he wants to take things further. So we're about innovation, we're about trying new models, and I think the key thing, again, that Tony said, and what was said by the first speaker as well, was around the whole point of trying new things. And I think one of the things that is really important is to have evidence. There's lots of hype around open peer review, and that's kind of where my title came from. I think there's lots of hype, and it's great for this, it's bad for this, and what we do not have is evidence. And I think for people who are trying to publish science, the whole kind of science of science is very poor, and there's a dearth of evidence. And often people use it as an excuse not to try new things, and I think that's where I think we have a responsibility to not fall into that trap. So I won't labour this. We know that the first kind of raft of descriptions there, that publishing, it's an outdated process. Many of the things and the processes that we currently use to share research is built on a process that's developed over hundreds of years. It's probably not fit for purpose today. And even the concept of peer review, it's a little bit mysterious when it first really started. I think the key thing we're trying to do with science is get an expert to comment on the research, whether at a grant stage, whether at an article stage. And I think how we have kind of built a house of cards almost on lots of things that have happened over the years, we can unpick some of these things. They're probably not fit for purpose. And sometimes tinkering around the edges doesn't change some of those things. I think there's a time we're in a place to, see it as a massive opportunity to sort of rethink how we share and make research available. The main thing is, it's about trying to use the research. Open access was never there just to allow people to visually see the research. The whole aim of open access is to be able to get hold of the research and actually use it, to have impact. And I think sometimes we get lost in the processes of trying to tinker with publishing processes and grant processes, but the main reason that funders fund research is to have impact. And the key thing here is we're trying to speed things up. So if there are things that we currently do that are making it inefficient, that we aren't able to have impact, then let's try and rethink those. But let's try and rethink those as a kind of collective ecosystem. We're all part of the same system. Again, stepping from a funder to a publisher, it struck me how little discussion there's been between funders and institutions and publishers when we're all essentially trying to do the same things. It doesn't matter if we're for profit or not for profit. I think there's a role for everybody, but the key thing is we should be trying to help science. That's what we're there for. That's what the market wants. That's what the researchers want. They want ways to help have impact. So peer review, there's many reports. This is a digital science report. There was a discussion last year, and you see lots of these reports saying that peer review is one of those pain points. It's maybe out of date in a lot of ways. How we use it, where we use it, when we use it is perhaps not always in the right place. I totally agree, one size doesn't fit all, but there's so much more we could be doing with where and how we use peer review. I just wanted to raise this as well, because I think sometimes, again, seeing peer review in the publishing domain, it's such an important issue for grants as well. And I think many of the issues with peer review apply equally to the grant funding industry and how grants are funded. There's lots of challenges within research funding in the first place, and peer review is a challenge there too. And it's all part of the same ecosystem again. And if there are ways that we can sort of learn how and what works in different places, when do we want experts? Do we want them to comment on the grant throughout how it's working, or just on the outputs at the end? There's a really interesting way of thinking about this. There are a number of publishers now who are increasingly working with funding agencies to help do that. And then on the practical side, there are so many, the same people who are reviewing grants are reviewing papers, and surely there's a way we could be more efficient about how to make sure that burden is kind of, minimized, but also people get credit and recognition for the work that they've done. The payment issue is really, really interesting. I think many funding agencies have tried paying peer reviewers. Most don't, because researchers see it as part of their scholarly contribution to science, but what they struggle with, I think, is the burden and when they get asked multiple times. And so as long as they're recognised for the work that they do, that's usually enough. I've got a few slides here, but don't worry about the detail on the right. I think this is interesting. This is a review at the previous study I just showed, which was done by RAND, who work with a lot of funding agencies. A lot of the grant peer review critique is exactly the same for publishing industry. So its peer review is too intensive. So the themes on the left side are the kind of ones I just wanted to read through. It takes too long. It slows down science. Peer review is blunt. One size does not fit all. Different types of peer review probably appropriate when the research is of a different caliber or a different type, or looking at a different type of grant. It doesn't always fund the best science. So are we risk averse? I mean, a lot of the discussion about when someone publishes something, they've already done the work. It's the same for grants. There's lots of kind of issues there. It's unreliable, it's biased, it's unaccountable and non-transparent, and it doesn't have the confidence of stakeholders. So a lot of people who get their grant turned down are really not happy with that decision, and they really have very minimal way of kind of, making a comment or being able to sort of discuss that to help them. So I just thought these are all the same themes that we talk about in publishing, so it's kind of very, very kind of interesting for me. This is a piece of work that I think was done by OpenAir. Was that you, Tony? All right, okay. So more of Tony's work. There's a growing support for transparency. That's not necessarily open peer review in every aspect, but it's hugely interesting how people talk about transparency versus open, and interesting. But there is a move for more transparency for all of the reasons that I mentioned. But I wanted to reiterate, it's for grants as well as publications. So we need to sort of think about whether there are opportunities to be more consistent and kind of start linking things together a little bit more. So just to go back to what I'm supposed to be talking about, can open peer review be part of this? Excuse me. So I think my bottom line is I don't know that we know in every aspect. I think open peer review can definitely add a lot of value in certain areas. Again, is this one of yours as well? I think I found this link to you as well. But certainly this is true. But we don't have an awful lot of evidence about what the downside is of that and how it works and when it's important to have transparency. So again, there's no consensus about what open peer review, which bits of it are important, when, and kind of how to use it best. Again, to go back to what Tony said, there are many different flavours of what open peer review is. And it struck me in the last session, someone was talking about the market for researchers. So if publishers are offering a particular service that a researcher would choose to kind of go and publish with them. I think it's really important that if we're all confused about what open peer review is and what a different publisher is offering or what a different funding agency is offering, that's hugely confusing market. So I don't think it's a very, very useful, kind of very clear market at this stage. So I don't think we can judge whether researchers are voting in full knowledge of what they're actually voting for or opting for. So that's kind of interesting. So, there's free versus invited commenting, whether reviews are available only after publication, named versus anonymity, and all of the above. So I'm just going to talk through what F1000 do because I'm here and I have the podium and I'm going to do that. But again, I don't think our model is necessarily right in every situation. I think the key thing is what we're trying to do is partner with different agencies to evolve that, make sure that it fits and works in different situations. And I think that's kind of the way that everyone will be helped. So let me just go through the model. So we use the phrase, and again, I'm not sure this is always understood by everybody. We use the phrase transparent, open, post-publication peer review. So yeah, there you go. There's another phrase. Not all open peer review is described like that. Some people, like I mentioned, there are different flavors of open peer review. This is the model that we have on F1000 research, and we also work with the Wellcome Trust and the Gates Foundation, and we have a couple of others that we're working with, and we adopt the very similar model. There are slight tweaks, but it's the main model. So essentially, we publish rapidly, which is definitely something that the market demands, and it's definitely something that funders and science demand. There's no need for all the hold-ups that we currently have. We do invited peer review, so that's another kind of misconception. And often people say, oh, can anybody comment on an article? It's peer review that's not invited. No, it's not. It's invited. We use experts. We work with the authors to get an expert to comment on the work. And the interesting thing there is that it changes the focus of peer review, which is why we're doing it. Instead of peer review being involved in the decision about whether something should be made public, the key thing is that peer review or expert comments is about helping the researchers to kind of evolve their work in the best way. So it reaches the best place it can be, so others can use it, all those kinds of things, and it speeds things up. That's what peer review, if you started again, that's what you'd want peer review to be. I cannot believe that anyone would say they wouldn't want that peer review to be that. Whether all the aspects that we do in addition make that perfect, but I think it's a real kind of move forward in that direction. But it's about helping the researchers to do the research and put the research in the best place it can possibly be. What we also do is something called versioning, and the articles are living, so the researchers can iterate, and you see how a research piece progresses online, but at every stage you know where it is with the peer reviews, what the peer reviewers have said, and the stage that it reaches ultimately when it gets indexed. And researchers can keep adding to that work. Continuous publishing, and that's kind of what researchers do. Instead of crafting things into stop points of research, that's not really how research works. It's not really how grants work, and it's just an interesting way to think about how research should be shared in a kind of the best way. Oh, sorry, I missed that one. How do I go back? Can I just go back? Oh, yeah. So these are, just to briefly, these are the platforms, these are the organisations that we're working with. So essentially we're saying to research organisations, here is an outlet that your researchers, if they want to share work rapidly, using our model and any kind of research findings, we will provide a service for the funding agencies and the research institutions. So we've got 2 research institutions. The most recent one we've just announced is with the Montreal Neurological Institute, who basically have a big endowment to fund open science. The endowment is basically saying, provide tools to anything that comes through the institute. You can get it out there quickly, people can use it. And F1000 is essentially providing the tools and the services. So we do the quality assurance around the peer review, we do the DOI registering, all those kinds of services that a publisher would do. But we provide the infrastructure, but it is the institution's kind of service for their researchers. So just to go back to the thing, this is the key thing that I think is important. We hear so much kind of, issues around what are the benefits of post-R model. And I think the key thing is we have to we know that there are problems with the existing system, and until we start building evidence around what works and what doesn't work, through experimentation and through open sharing of what that work says, then we'll never really make much progress. So I'm just going to whip through. These are the sorts of questions that we get asked a lot, and I've got a bit of a research background, so these are some of the things that we've been looking at over the past few years. So with open peer review models, is the response rate different? Are people less or more likely to respond to a request when it's open? And are there differences according to whether someone's senior, where they are, those kinds of things? When I say senior, I mean academically senior, all those kinds of things. Men, women, we've seen some really interesting trends. But again, that's really important data, and it's good. We need it out there. Do people give more considered response when it's open? It's interesting, Uli Purcell's work has showed some really interesting kind of, blown some of the kind of hype out of the water, and it's been really good to see that kind of information, but it is the only piece of information around that I've seen, and I'd like to see more of that. When you put your comments and you sign them, are you more constructive? Do you help the researcher? So we've been seeking feedback from some authors to say, actually, has it helped you better? Do you feel more kind of constructive? What we don't want to do is say, has it dumbed down what they'll say to you? So we're also looking at that, but we're not seeing that at the moment. One of the things, I'm just going to quickly show an example. We've looked at level of agreement among reviewers. So if it's completely open and you post a peer review comment on the site, and then a second reviewer, before they post their comment, are they able to see what the peer reviewer has said? Does that influence their likelihood to agree? So we've done some initial analysis, and it doesn't seem that is totally the case. There is agreement, but it's not. There's no evidence around that it's more than you would expect normally. So we've done all the stats on that. But again, what we haven't got is an evidence base to compare that to. All the closed peer review systems, you just don't have. There is no data. There are no data to compare it to. So again, there's lots of people shooting down open peer review without showing us where the evidence is that it's any other models are any better. The time involved, is it quicker, open versus closed? And I think one of the key things is to incentivize peer review more generally, never mind open-closed, is the ability to get credit and visibility for the work and the time that you've spent contributing to the work of others. I'll miss that one up. So quickly, an example. This is our peer review model. I'll whip through this because I'm running it. But essentially, we've just published a poster on the site basically showing that there was no evidence of it being, systematically influenced by the reviewer. So yeah, we just published that. So just quickly, this is my key thing. Oh, yeah, that one. My last bullet, science of science. We are so poor at that. And I think, again, as an organisation, I'm working with funding agencies, we could do so much more about that, making information about open access and open data and open science models. Why don't we just put it out there? The evidence is quite poor, and must be tons of data and information in this room that we could share. Organisations like Crossref and the IO4C projects are really going to help these kinds of things, but it's really something that we could do collaboratively. And I think more generally, open peer review is part of a discussion about how and when we use experts throughout the whole process of science, from dealing with grants to dealing with publications to tenureship, all those kinds of things. But maybe the terms peer review aren't quite right. But we sometimes need to just step back and think about where and how and what next. So thank you for your time. Sorry if I've gone over.
Thank you very much, Liz. Okay, now we have about 10 minutes to take questions from the floor, and yes, please. I don't know. Katrina.
Hello, Katrina McCallum. Is it on? Yes. Katrina McCallum from Hindawi. One of the problems about peer review is the lack of evidence we have that even the traditional model works. And a key barrier to this is also, how do you open up the existing data that all the publishers have when there are confidentiality agreements, either explicit or implicit, where there's actually no incentive for anyone to open up and air their dirty washing, whether you're a publisher or a reviewer or an author. And so do you have any ways that you think we can actually open up that black box and get independent researchers perhaps addressing some of the questions that you asked, which I think are absolutely crucial to whether traditional peer review works, let alone whether open peer review works better than traditional peer review, and how can we start to sort of work together to get hold of that data in a sort of safe way?
I'm not sure.
That was primarily addressed to Liz and Tony, but
yeah, from the grant side, there have been initiatives, and then what often has happened is that if a funding agency was trying to do some work around this, they'd go and talk. They'd have to request of the grantees, do you mind sharing your data? So almost go back in retrospective to get their permission. I guess that's quite. I haven't really thought that through. I guess that's quite a laborious thing, but. There must be some way of anonymising data sets, to be able to just push the data without, looking at some of the demographic issues, all those kinds of things that I suspect wouldn't be too problematic, but data protection is not my specialty.
So, is this on? Yeah. So the first thing to say is that such data sharing is already happening. So the Peary network do have some of the major publishers on board to share data, and I think that external researchers can have access to that corpus, and I think they're just working on a process for application at the moment. So that's the first thing to say. So it doesn't always have to be open data, but even in the case where there is a lot of confidentiality and copyright issues, there will be a lot of information that could be made open anyway and suitably anonymized, but about review times or dates of acceptance or geographical location of reviewers, and this kind of thing could be made available. But I'm afraid that in general, I'm not sure that it's in the interest or that it's in the way of doing things of kind of what I might call the old-fashioned publishers, because there is money in metrics and there's money in data. And if you look at Publons was acquired by Clarivate, who were an analytics company. And so I'm not sure that there will, I think that there would be an incentives hurdle to get over there. But I think that we could work on it by pressing that this is the work of researchers contributed freely, and that information made available to everybody would help improve the quality assurance of the quality assurance process of science. So just the ethical question. In terms of open data, as I said, with a lot of the open access publishers who already publish a lot of this information, you won't have those issues, but it will be a question of getting everybody together to collect and expose the information in uniform ways to make finding it, accessing it, and reusing it, comparing it easy for the multitude. I think that was it.
I was going to say, one of the things that is really interesting as well is obviously rethinking things like bibliometric indicators, thinking about other aspects of scholarly output. So some of the work perhaps that an independent place like CWTS doing in Holland, there's maybe a way to kind of think about expanding, that whole corpus of information, basically adding in more metadata around scholarly outputs instead of just citations and blah. There's so much more we can do. And just another thing, I hate the word altmetrics because it makes everything seem secondary. I'll just chuck that in there. But it would be really good to have a wider range of metrics that are all seen in the same, they're different for different purposes, and I think that's really important that we start to push that as well.
I mean, if I can say a word about metrics, which is something we have in the future, I think the initiative for open citations is going to transform everything, because it's going to allow people like me to just code a little Python method that's going to give you your favorite metrics index. Maybe you want to divide citations by the number of authors. This has been discussed before. Maybe you want to do it whatever way. So I think we can even think of meta-metrics, where we make available factually the database of information to be then crawled and hacked and used by people. And the idea would be divide and conquer, instead of having the single impact factor or H-index positive integer metric, which I already find insulting. You could have a whole variety, a whole zoology of metrics, and then you can ask yourself which ones work well, which ones actually tell you things you already know anyway. So much development in the future, I think. So. It's also maybe one thing I can tell to funders: if you want to have one useful mandate, force publishers to join the initiative for open citations. Do not reimburse APCs if publishers don't join it, things like that.
It's not a question. It's not a question, but a comment. I very much liked the presentation by Jean-Sébastien Caux on the SciPost, of which I was not aware, I must admit. I should point out that last year, 3 national academies, the Royal Society, Académie des Sciences, and the Leopoldina from Germany, Switzerland, and Austria, made a document that was presented to Moedas, Commissioner, on good practice in publishing. And what you presented here almost perfectly fitted this. So, congratulations.
Thank you. I wasn't aware of this document, but maybe this shows that there's independent reasons to do that.
Thank you. David Prosser from Research Libraries UK. We talk about the potential of open peer review to allow us to start to reward reviewers and for that effort to get a reward. Are there any funders or institutions who are now actually rewarding people for their reviewing effort? And if not, if they started to do that, then that would be a huge incentive for reviewers to start to sign their reviews.
I do know that some funders, when you put a grant application into a funder, you could put, there is always space for you to put other things that you've been doing for science, and for years people have put on, I'm on a peer review panel, or I've peer reviewed this work, I've done lots of peer review. People do put that on, whether it's valued, I don't know, that's the different thing, but I think the problem is that the data aren't there systematically, and it's quite hard to make a judgment based on kind of an anecdote, maybe that's the wrong word for it, but it's a narrative, but there is space for that kind of work, and it's definitely coming. I remember Robert is the only funder that I know that's in the room, Robert Kiley, but we can't hear him from the back, so...
So for academic journals, not really. However, for granting agencies, of course, there's the ERC that has a very, very well-organized system of, gratifying reviewers. If you sit on one of the panels of the ERC, you will actually be shipped to Brussels multiple times, and you will actually have your salary effectively substituted from the ERC. So in that case, I think it's much easier for them to motivate people to indeed serve on the commissions and provide rather extensive refereeing reports. I was lucky with the ERC. I just got an ERC advanced grant a few months ago, and I got the referee reports for that, a whole collection, a whole stack of very professionally researched and detailed reports, and I don't think these would have happened unless the ERC gave funding like that. Now, this is the ERC, they can actually afford to do it. They can do that. I don't think, essentially, you could do that easily for all publications in all journals. The volume would be too massive. So in a sense, my personal opinion, and you'll hear different things from different researchers, I would much rather strike a deal as a scientist to say, no, don't give me any money for the publication refereeing that I'm doing, but at least allow me to put this in my output, if you want. Allow me to have this as a valuable, long-lasting contribution to the scientific debate. And then, this is just my daily job. And I think the vast majority of scientists would be happy to sign this contract.
I think I heard that the Crossref is now working on a project to create a special DOI for reviews. There's lots of review material that is under supplemental material where you have a great review report, but it's tagged in the XML as supplemental material. We have a whole system we heard from Hypothesis of annotations. At some point, we need to start thinking about how can we aggregate the review activity around these articles that happens post-publication, because I think then we can also start getting people more excited about putting their names, writing things post-publication. If they can see, oh, it's happening in different places, actually matters, people are looking at it. So I think as a whole community, we have to really start thinking about this next step. Right now, everybody's doing lots of different experiments, Science Open also one of them, but I think it'll be important to start pulling those together sort of as we go forward.
if I may quickly react to that. So now I'm putting my programmer's hat on. So the guy who does the XML uploads to Crossref and things like that. Fantastic, badly needed. In fact, not rocket science, kind of easy to get. I think the Crossref initiative is absolutely fantastic. One little comment is that there is one kind of conceptual flaw in the thing, and I hope that this can be corrected before we go. Right? So the actual new peer review content of Crossref has to be associated, it has to be anchored on a publication's DOI, which makes it very difficult, for example, if you don't accept the publication. Then you have to bin the reports. So this is a fundamental thing to address before we go large scale on this. I think there should be an optional link to a publication DOI, but the actual refereeing packet content should be like a multi-headed hydra that can be built by various publishers and eventually associated to a publication or not. And I think it's very important to implement that before this becomes large scale, because otherwise you are desensitivizing, or whatever you said, the referees who actually reject papers. And you don't want to do that.